Good morning, folks. And if you're watching this in Newcastle, I'll let you into a little secret. It's not always like this. So, ever since lockdown, I think we've had one bad day. Uh, Stunning weather. Long may it continue. Today's message from Mull kind of follows on from what we were talking about yesterday around challenging your balance and the importance of that. And today's message really is COVID-19 is not the only disease we need to avoid at the minute. And there is another disease that's been termed more recently called sitting disease. And a lot of health experts feel that as we go forward, it's not just lack of exercise, formal exercise, that's the problem. It's the high periods of time spent in a seated position. And that's what's really fueling the obesity epidemic that we're suffering today in the Western world. And it's causing a lot of other problems as well. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the skeleton today, um, and then why that seated position is so damaging. And Katie's going to be along a little bit later today or tomorrow, and talk to you a little bit more about the issues that we're having, especially those that are working at home at the minute and spending a lot of time on the backside. So back to the skeleton, and our skeleton is kind of like the scaffolding of our body. It protects our brain, it protects our spinal cord, it protects our heart and lungs as well. And it also provides a solid structure for the attachments of muscle tissues, which provide postural stability and movement. And bone is formed of collagen fibers. These are a sort of protein surrounded by a more rigid structure, and that's formed primarily more of calcium. So bones are a bit like they're a bit like reinforced concrete, really, when they're healthy. So they have tensile strength; they can bend slightly, and they also um, can sustain high amounts of sort of compressive forces as well. But they are really good design because they don't weigh that much. So your skeleton accounts for less than a tenth of your body's weight, and yet it can withstand really high forces. Um, Now, bone will it's living tissue, obviously, and it remolds itself and repairs itself, and we remold about 10% of our skeletal structure every year. So you're always renewing it, and that's why calcium intake is so important. And one of the issues that we have is our skeleton also acts as a sort of mineral store for calcium. Now, your body needs calcium for other things other than just bones and teeth. So we need calcium in our blood for muscle contraction, for blood clotting purposes, for the function of your heart as well, um, and for the action of nerve impulses. So your body will take calcium away from your bone tissue and absorb it into the bloodstream. And this is why calcium intake is really important, because we're always using up that store to some extent. And if there's not enough calcium going in, then the stores of calcium can drop, and then your bone health can suffer as a result. So as we tend to get a little bit older, our bone structure tends to be compromised. So the architecture of the bone tends to get a bit compromised, and that can lead to things like osteoporosis, or osteopenia, which is sort of borderline osteoporosis. And this can increase our risk of fractures. And the most common fractures that we see are wrist and spine and hip. Hip being the really bad one that we spoke about yesterday, and really trying to avoid that. And sometimes we almost joke with folks that are at risk of falls, that we're going to train them to break their wrist. and they think, what are you on about? But actually, we don't just need to work the muscle tissue of the legs. We also want to strengthen up the upper body, because if, God forbid, you do fall, um, and you are going to go to ground, then the first thing that we want to hit the ground is your hand. So that dissipates that impact, and the first thing that hits the ground isn't either the hip or the head, because that can lead to a lot of really bad injuries. If the wrist breaks, yeah, it's painful, it's annoying, um, but it's not the end of the world. Wrists will recover, but hips, head injuries, sometimes they can be much worse. So we know that bone tissue and bone density is lost when we're not active. And one of the best ways of telling this is if when you bring people back from space travel and they've been in a weightless environment for a while, and gravity hasn't even been acting on their bones, their bone tissue is really depleted and they can barely walk. And we also know that athletes that are involved in high impact sports, such as gymnastics, they have incredibly strong bones. Their bone mass is much higher. Now, obviously, we're not going to get to either one of those extremities, but it does sort of show how important it is that we keep putting pressure through the bones and we're not sitting down for long periods of time. And it's been shown that if you have a life of regular physical activity, your chance of having a fracture in later life is reduced by 50%. So it's really important that we stay active and spend as little time as possible sat down. And if you think about it, these days, we do spend a lot of time sat down. A lot of today's work practices involve sitting in front of a PC with really bad posture, which is something I'm suffering from at the minute. And a lot of our hobbies revolve around technology now, again, where we tend to be sat down, whether it be on the phone, the iPad, or watching the TV, watching movies. And that's the same for a lot of kids these days. They're growing up with these inactive hobbies. So, and another thing to say, and they're in the limelight at the minute, but for all the bad reasons, is care homes. And when people go into a care home, they tend to spend 80 to 90% of their time sat down. And when that happens, we start to suffer not just big losses of muscle tissue, but bone density as well. So it makes us far more prone to falls and fractures. So it's really important that people that are in care homes do get up and move around on a regular basis. So the cumulative effects of all this is that we end up with lower bone density, less postural stability, more pain, more disability, and we also lose lung function and field of vision. And you might be wondering, what are you on about there, Rob? But if you think about it, if we suffer low bone density in our spine, we tend to sit more curved forward. So our posture starts to suffer. And if you're down here, then your lungs are really being squashed. We're not in that effective breathing position where we'll have a nice long spine and the head's up here. So your lung function and your breathing function starts to suffer. And if your head is lower, then your field of vision is restricted. You can give it a go now. If you stoop forward, start to realize what's happening to your breathing, and then look at where your field of vision is. And as we spoke about yesterday, sight is one of the real key cues as to how we maintain balance. So really important that that we get up and we move and we stay active and we spend as little time as possible sat down. And I'm going to finish that up there. And I'm hoping Katie will be along either today or tomorrow with a little sort of progression to that based around the fact that a lot of us are spending a lot of time sat down at the minute if we're working from home, and what the cumulative effects of that can be, and hopefully some ways of coming away from that. So as always, if you're watching on the YouTube channel, please subscribe, and hopefully you will get out and get a nice walk in today. No wind at all, so calm, stunning. And you take care, guys, and stay safe. Bye bye.